Hello and welcome, I'm Joshua Barnes and you're watching The World Reports. Let's first take a look at some headlines. The United States military has carried out airstrikes in Yemen's capital Sana'a. Targets include a missile storage facility and a command and control site. The US Central Command says the strikes were aimed at disrupting Houthi operations. This comes following a strike in Israel's Tel Aviv that was claimed by the Houthi group. Negotiations for a Gaza ceasefire in Doha are 90% completed, according to multiple sources. However, key issues remain, including Israel's military presence in the Philadelphia corridor. One proposed solution is a buffer zone along Israel's border with Gaza. Russia's defense ministry says 42 Ukrainian drones have been destroyed across 5 regions overnight. Meanwhile, a video has emerged showing a Ukrainian sniper moments before being executed by Russian forces. His execution is said to be one of many. A memorial for victims of Friday's car ramming attack in Magdeburg has been marred with protest. Far-right members have taken to the streets against the attack. This reflects rising political tensions in Germany. The far-right AfD party's popularity is growing amid debates over immigration. China has protested America's latest military and arms sales to Taiwan. A foreign ministry spokesperson called on the US to stop undermining peace in the Taiwan Strait. This follows the White House's announcement of $571.3 million in aid and $295 million in arms sales. A crash between a bus and a lorry in Brazil has killed at least 38 people. 13 others have been taken to hospital following the incidents. This year in Brazil, more than 10,000 people have lost their lives in traffic accidents, according to the Ministry of Transportation. In a series of military actions, the US military has conducted precision airstrikes targeting a missile storage facility and a command and control facility in Yemen's capital, Sana'a. These strikes, aimed at disrupting Houthi operations, come in response to the group's attacks on US Navy warships and merchant vessels in the Red Sea and Gulf of Aden. The strikes follow increased tensions with Houthi attacks on commercial shipping, as well as a missile strike on Tel Aviv. Israel has also launched strikes against the Houthi-held ports and energy infrastructure. In a separate incident, a US fighter jet was shot down in a friendly fire incident by the USS Gettysburg. Despite the setback, the US remains focused on weakening the Iran-backed Houthi group, seeking global support to curb their control over Red Sea shipping lanes. We are now joined by our first guest, Professor Madhav Nalapat, who is the editorial director of the Sunday Guardian. I'd like to ask you first about the significance of this strike that we've had, Professor Madhav Nalapat. Looking at the US action, of course, there has been action from the Houthis on shipping, specifically Western shipping, but this also comes in the wake of an attack on Israel that got through the Iron Dome. So can you talk to us about the sort of importance of these US attacks?
Well, I'd like to point out that it was definitely a necessary response, not a sufficient response, but a necessary response. The fact is that the Houthi leadership is putting to risk the entire people of Yemen. Innocent people in Sana'a and other locations in Yemen are suffering because of the folly of the Yemeni leadership, which believes that it can eliminate the state of Israel. State of Israel is a fact of life. It's a fact of life they will have to live with. And those who try to eliminate it and further extending it to any vessel that goes to Israel or suspected of going to Israel or carries an Israeli flag, look, this is an interference with international shipping that's a risk to every single country. So I think the United States has done, frankly, the bare minimum in disrupting their operations. And I'm really saddened that the Houthi leadership is basically destroying the lives of its own people and making them destitute, making them homeless, making them educationless, making them without any proper health care as a consequence of the obsession of this leadership towards the impossible goal of eliminating the state of Israel. The state of Israel is a reality, and that reality has to be acknowledged in the way so many very moderate and modern governments in the region have. And the Houthis, I think, better smell the coffee and do the same.
Yes, and Daniel Rubinstein, who we are also joined by, the former advisor to Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu. I'd like to speak to you specifically about the response that we've seen from Israel and, of course, from the US. Now, the reasons for these strikes against the Yemen Houthis is potentially different, but what is the feeling within Israel given the attack on Tel Aviv yesterday and the claims that they were ballistic missiles, but despite that, there were no casualties and the damage seemed to be minor?
The feeling in Israel is that we have been under attack for more than a year by the Iranian regime and its proxies on 7 different fronts around our borders. We're talking about the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, Syria, Lebanon, militias in Iraq, Yemen, and the Iranian regime itself. So this is not the first time that a ballistic missile has been fired from Yemen at Israel. And I think the view of the Israeli public is that the international response to this aggression has been far too slow and far too late. For more than a year, an army of pirates, which is effectively who this is, the Houthis, they are an army of pirates, has effectively shut down international shipping in the Red Sea. This is an act of piracy on the high seas. If you have a ship and you want to sail through the Red Sea, there's a good chance that the Houthi pirates in Yemen will seize your ship, take your cargo, hold you hostage, and demand a ransom. This is not a way to conduct international affairs, and it is the way that the Houthis have been conducting international affairs with the support of the Iranian regime. This is the key part. The Houthis are not producing their own ballistic missiles. They have missiles that can fire 2,000 kilometers into Tel Aviv, which is what they did yesterday. So the Israeli public, the Israeli people are hoping that the international community will wake up and see that the problem of the Houthis in Yemen is not just a local problem confined to the Red Sea. It affects all of international shipping and all of international security. And it's unfortunate that the victims of the Houthi aggression are the people of Yemen who are paying the price for having a government that chooses aggression rather than to take care of its own people.
Daniel, I want to bring you back to the role of Iran here. Of course, the Houthis are backed by Iran, and we've seen other groups backed by Iran met with, let's be honest, the full force of the Israeli military. What do you think the Israeli response to these attacks will be? Will we see a military incursion like we've seen elsewhere in the region, or do you think it calls for a different sort of response?
I think it calls for a different sort of response for a couple of reasons. One, the threat is very far away from Israel's borders. And two, the threat is not just to Israel. The threat is to every country in the world, specifically countries that are in the Red Sea that rely on international shipping, such as Egypt. The revenue that Egypt gets from passage through the Suez Canal has taken an enormous hit because a group of pirates further down the sea has stopped shipping in Egypt. So I would hope and expect that all of the world powers, the United Nations, the United States, the UK, China, whoever has an interest in safe international shipping will form some sort of coalition that will send a clear message to these pirates in Yemen that enough is enough, and it will not just be for the country of Israel to resolve on its own.
Thank you, Daniel. We'll stick in the Middle East as talks for a ceasefire between Israel and Hamas are nearing completion, with reports indicating that 90% of the deal has been agreed. However, critical issues remain, including the Israeli military presence and the strategically significant Fidelfi corridor. Discussions in Doha are focused on the creation of a buffer zone along Israel's border with Gaza, and once these issues are resolved, a 3-stage ceasefire could be implemented in the coming days. The deal could see the exchange of 20 Palestinian prisoners for every female soldier released in the first stage, and it would include the gradual release of hostages. Additionally, Gaza would be monitored by a committee of technocrats with oversight by Egypt and Qatar. Meanwhile, Pope Francis has condemned the Israeli airstrikes in Gaza, calling the attacks cruelty and not war, emphasising the need for a global community to examine whether the military offensive could be considered genocide. The Pope's words come amid escalating violence and calls for international accountability. Daniel, I'd like to come back to you here. We have had several reports within the last few days using the word genocide. Strikes in Gaza are continuing, but we can't forget that this conflict has started after the October 7th attacks. In terms of the feeling within Israel, do you think that the retaliation has been proportionate given the atrocities that happened on the October the 7th, but also given the humanitarian crises that are taking place across Gaza?
In Gaza, on October the 7th of 2023, the government of Gaza was Hamas. It was the Hamas government of Gaza that sent 3,000 men into Israel to invade, to massacre, to gun down people in their homes, to commit barbaric sexual atrocities, and to take 251 hostages. Now, this wasn't just a one-day event. Hamas started a war and they fired thousands of rockets into Israel. And Hamas continues to attack Israel to this day and demand a ransom for the surviving hostages that it holds and also the bodies of those that it killed. So the response from Israel to this barbaric Hamas aggression was to say that Hamas can no longer be the government of Gaza and it can no longer have a military in Gaza. So these are the clear aims of the war, is the dismantlement of Hamas's military and government capabilities. Right now, as we speak, Hamas continues to wage war. It continues to attack Israelis. It continues to hold hostages. And since Hamas continues to wage war, its fighters, the terrorists of Hamas, are legitimate military targets under international humanitarian law. The threat that Israel faces is the threat of annihilation. The distance between Hamas in Gaza and Israeli civilians, it's a very short distance. We're talking about a distance of a few football fields that Hamas guys were able to move in a very quick fashion on October the 7th. It's a very short distance. The people of Israel cannot live a very short distance from people who are swearing to annihilate them and to carry out more massacres like we saw on October the 7th. So Israel is fighting a just war, and it is fighting it justly, and it will continue to fight this war until Hamas lays down its arms and releases the hostages.
Professor Madhav Nalapat, I want to come back to you specifically looking at hostages and the role that hostages will have in any ceasefire deal. There are reports that we're around 90% of the way towards that ceasefire deal. Do you think we could see something similar to what we've seen in Lebanon with a slow sort of retreat from Israeli forces? And do you think that will be sufficient in terms of what both sides are looking for in these ceasefire negotiations that until now and ongoing are at a bit of a standstill?
Well, look, I'd like to point out that Israel has to be and remains committed to ensure that an October 7 kind of attack does not happen again. And frankly, I think Netanyahu was caught napping. He knew exactly who was ruling Gaza since 2005. I don't think it came as a big shock that Hamas was ruling Gaza. It started in 2005. And if you look at Hamas videos, if you look at the statements of Hamas leaders, and if you examine them, as my research teams have, you will find that the elimination of the Jewish people, not just the state of Israel, but the Jewish people are front and center of the objectives. So I think, frankly, Netanyahu was caught napping, and he never realized the threat that, frankly, Hamas very openly proclaimed was its intentions. So having done that, I don't think he wants to be shocked into action a second time. And I don't believe that the Israelis are going to stop until the military wing of Hamas is completely degraded and destroyed. There's no question of stopping before that. I want to point out to you, at the beginning of this century, if you remember, an Air India flight was hijacked and brought to Kandahar. And as a consequence of all the pressure from the relatives and friends and everything, the government at that point in time released some hardened prisoners. And frankly, as a consequence, those who were released were terrorists, and they committed acts which amounted to several more human lives being lost as a consequence of the release of the terrorists. So I don't think Israel is going to follow that route. And I would like to say, as Hamas is concerned, Donald Trump is coming. He's going to be sworn in on the 20th of January. And if he finds that Hamas has made short work of whatever remaining hostages there are, well, I think he's going to make short work of Hamas. And in the process, again, it's the people of Gaza, including many innocent people of Gaza who have nothing to do with Hamas, who are going to pay the steepest price. Hamas is basically playing with the lives of the people of Gaza. And the sooner it releases all the hostages it has as a goodwill gesture, the better. But the fact is, this offensive cannot stop until 2007 is repeated. And I again repeat, Netanyahu was caught napping on October 7 last year, and I don't think he wants to be caught napping a second time around.
Madhav Nalapat, thank you so much for joining us. Also, Daniel Rubenstein, thank you. We will continue to bring you the latest updates on the fighting across the Middle East. But moving on, we have a story coming out of Europe, and we continue to talk about the horrific car ramming attack at the Magdeburg Christmas market, which has claimed 5 lives and left over 200 injured. Here's how the city and the country are coping with this tragic incident.
A festive evening turned into a nightmare at Magdeburg's Christmas market when an SUV ploughed through a crowd at high speed. 5 lives were lost, including a young child, and over 200 people were injured. The attack left a trail of devastation and sorrow, shaking the country to its core. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz visited the site to pay tribute to the victims. Dressed in black, he joined regional politicians to mourn and show solidarity with the city of Magdeburg.
Was für eine furchtbare Tat ist das, dort mit solcher Brutalität so viele Menschen zu verletzen und zu töten. Wir haben mittlerweile erfahren, dass es über 200 sind, die verletzt worden sind. 5 sind bisher gestorben. Unglaublich viele.
The suspect, Taleb Jawad al-Abdulmuhsen, a 37-year-old man, has been taken into custody. Prosecutors suggest the attack may have stemmed from his frustration with Germany's treatment of refugees.
Gegenwärtigem Stand sieht es so aus, dass Hintergrund der Tat, wie soll ich das jetzt formulieren, Unzufriedenheit mit dem Umgang mit saudi-arabischen Flüchtlingen in Deutschland gewesen sein könnte.
As the investigation continues, the tragic attack has triggered anger and fear among residents in Magdeburg. Many are demanding accountability and stronger measures to prevent such incidents. A memorial service was held at Magdeburg Cathedral, with over 2,000 attendees standing in solidarity with the victims. The somber event was a moment for reflection, as mourners grappled with the senseless violence.
Es ist schockiert, traurig, fassungslos, dass sowas hier in Magdeburg passiert. Genau, vor allem Traurigkeit überwiegt, genau.
Despite the tragedy, Germany's Christmas markets remain open, a symbol of resilience. Visitors and vendors are determined not to let fear overshadow the spirit of the holidays.
Ensuite, bon, on a vu qu'il y avait des voitures de police un petit peu partout, donc je ne dis pas qu'on se sent protégé, mais je crois qu'il faut... non, je crois qu'il faut sortir, je crois qu'il faut continuer. La vie ne peut pas s'arrêter... ne peut pas s'arrêter avec... Bien sûr, c'est dramatique ce qui s'est passé, c'est abominable, mais je crois qu'il faut aller de l'avant.
Let's now take a look at some news updates from the Indo-Pacific region. The military's media wing stated that a Pakistani military court sentenced 25 civilians to between 2 and 10 years of rigorous imprisonment for attacking military facilities in 2023. The verdict fuels concerns among jailed former PM Imran Khan's supporters about increased military court involvement in his cases. Protests erupted on May the 9th, 2023, after Khan's arrest, leaving 8 dead. The Chinese bulk carrier Yipeng 3 is again moving after sitting still for more than a month in a nearby Danish shipping lane. It is under investigation following a breach of 2 fibre optic cables in the Baltic Sea. On Thursday, China allowed investigators from Germany, Sweden, Finland and Denmark to board the vessel, ending a month-long diplomatic standoff. The death toll from the LPG tanker explosion in the Jaipur-Ajmer highway has risen to 14, with over 30 people in critical conditions. The blast, triggered by a collision with a truck, caused a massive fire, destroying at least 37 vehicles. The Supreme Court Committee has sought a report from the Rajasthan Chief Secretary. The state has announced 5 lakh rupees ex gratia, and the centre will provide 2 lakh rupees. That is all we have time for. We'll be back shortly with more of the latest international news updates.
Magdeburg.